Welcome to Friendly Fire Podcast, debate podcast where we discuss and digest hot and controversial topics. Today, our topic is an all-time classic. This house supports the death penalty. We are your hosts, Al
and Oliver.
And today we'll be discussing this hot topic.
So I'll be arguing on the side of proposing the death penalty, and I'll be labelling throughout my side exactly what sort of crimes we'd expect the death penalty to be used for, some of the moral arguments on where the death penalty first occurred and why, some of the political framing that is still very significant today and that reasoning for the death penalty, and as well as some examples of some particular states at the moment that have implemented a more harsh regime in terms of criminal justice, and how that has favoured in the population and led to great benefits among said state, despite the outrage in much of Western media. So a good place to start is to look at the origins of the death penalty in the modern day judicial system. Of course, a great example of this is America. But first we do need to go back right till the origins. And this starts with, of course, the idea of the social contract. Many conservatives and libertarians reject the idea of a wide inherited social contract, but its significance in politics cannot be understated. This first originated from utilitarian theorists, much that is discussed to this day. But a better reference to find a definition and true discussion of the social contract can be John Locke. John Locke, of course, recognised certain natural rights, those being the rights to life, liberty and property, the ability to, of course, accumulate private property and capital. Now, he also stated that these rights sought to be protected, and for such rights to be protected, us as a population would need to give up certain original liberties, like, in the original state of humanity, people were able to murder each other without being imprisoned. Of course, that liberty, what was a liberty, is now no longer the case, and that's to guard the more supreme and important right to life. I know that this is a very controversial one to bring up in a proposition for a death penalty argument, but it's important to recognise this giving up of rights to save others. Now, of course, no advocate of the death penalty is advocating for all crimes to be subject to the penalty itself. As people advocating for the death penalty, we focus on the most grotesque and hideous crimes imaginable. One such prominent example is John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy seemed a normal construction worker, visit families as a clown, and would be a functioning member of society. Turns out he had a devious secret that he kept from the people around him. Once they found him under suspicion of kidnapping a 15-year-old boy. The boy went missing after last being seen with John Wayne Gacy. So his house was investigated, only to find 30 bodies buried underneath his garden. It turns out that in later investigation, it would be revealed that he not only murdered his victims, but also raped and tortured young kids. This is an evil man by any regards, and this man deserved to die. Anyone looking at these facts would surely agree that this man was no longer functional, was no longer able to be rehabilitated, and not only that, those families, if he wasn't killed, would have no form of justice. They would be torn by the atrocities that such a man had gotten away with. It's also important to recognise in this debate and put ourselves in the shoes of those families, those victims that suffered such a horrible fate. If your family had been killed and abused by a criminal such as this, how would you feel? Because it's the sort of scenario where you're allowed to elicit anger. I would be angry if that happened to my family. In fact, it would almost be an explanation for homicidal maniacy. I mean, it's a horrible situation, and that closure that the death penalty offers to those families of the victims is important and should be protected. It is important, and it comes from the very origins of the advocation of the death penalty, that being eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Now, in much of this debate on the right side and Christianity, moralists, you have a focus on religion. And it's important to regard this significance of religion with modern day democracy. Much of democracy is supported and as well comes from a Judeo-Christian sense of morality. And eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is not only a religious statement, but also it states how we perceive justice as humans. We have this instinct to want justice, and that is where eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth really comes in. It's not just a religious argument, but a very important sociological argument.
Now, as to the opposition, you can argue and give an example of an innocent person. Imagine that you have a close family member to you, and now not only he is labeled by the media and his reputation or her reputation is fully ruined, but now their life, the most important thing that they possess, their life is now taken. At the core of the opposition's argument is the fact that there are risks for putting the innocent people to death. But let's say the technology, let's say other factors are taken into account, and let's go for the argument that even if we know for 100% that the person that killed and murdered and did something horrific is the person who did that, we still have arguments against that. And there are two arguments against that. Although the proposition argues that we should value the life and go tooth for tooth, and that's why we should kill as a way to say that the life is precious. You can also say oppositely. By not taking the life of another person, we value the very value that the life itself has. It's as a fundamental human right principle, right? And another argument that you can say is that by going with the example of tooth for tooth, eye for an eye, you perpetuate violence in the society. As a society, you want to hold a moral ground, a high moral ground, where principles and human rights are respected. By perpetuating the cycle of violence and revenge, you are putting the mindset in the societies that killing is justifiable response to wrongdoing. And one of the results of this can be is that people just go on and try to take revenge, because now we have an example that, hey, we have a death penalty, we can go eye for an eye. Why don't I do it myself? Why don't I do some violence, right? And as a society, you do not want to erode the moral fabric. And there will be more examples and more arguments on the opposition, but I just wanted to make a quick response to what the proposition has told you today.
Okay, so there are two things that I planned for the opposition to say, and I have come up with some good combats against what my co-host Al just spoken about. So he mentioned the value of a life, and this is a very important concept. How do we place value on life, and how do we measure up the value of life? Now, if we just had sentencing, prison sentencing, let's go for the life sentence of 40 years in some countries. Sometimes it's up to 50 in other countries, but let's go for 40 years. So the life sentence of 40 years isn't equal to murder, of course. So is that now understating each life of being equal? The whole practical issue with this value of life would surely lead us to come to the conclusion that each life is as valuable as another life. So why would we undervalue the sentencing of that not being the same? No, we can't take life because that is unequal to another instance of taking of life. So the practical argument that the death penalty undermines value of life is it's a very difficult argument to make. And then what my co-host Al also mentioned is the inevitability of a violent society due to the death penalty being present. Of course, the death penalty has been present in history, and we still had a lower murder rate in certain countries that have lowered their use of the death penalty. So, for example, if we look at El Salvador, they've recently harshened their punishment towards many gangs, including a wide use of the death penalty to such gangs, yet their murder rate has almost halved. It seems that the death penalty is a good example of greater justice and a more peaceful society by and large. And Al also mentioned about how this could be almost like a green light to regular members of society and the population. Of course, we're not talking about the death penalty being executed by civilians. We're talking about the death penalty being executed by the state. And initially, yes, I do have my own preconceptions on the idea of increasing the power of the state. But are we gonna really stumble at the point of giving the government more power for the sake of injustice? It seems that I would be better to prioritise justice to those who have suffered so terribly than I don't particularly want the state to have this much power. It's a bit uncomfortable, but it is still one of the better arguments that the opposition can make in this debate.
So it seems that there is a stalemate regarding the moral argument. The proposition tells you that if we really value life, then taking someone's life should be equal to taking your own life if you are the murderer. And the opposition is telling you that we cannot take another person's life because even if it is a criminal, because it is a life and we value life. So I don't see both arguments trying to being better than another in this case. But let me just quickly cover on the two things that have been mentioned by the proposition. Firstly, it was mentioned regarding the El Salvador and how the country is way more peaceful with the death penalty. Well, one can easily argue that the reason why the crime rates have significantly dropped is not because of the death penalty, but because so many gang members have been taken into the prison and have been taken accountable for their actions. And because now you have less violent members of society on the street is why you have less crimes. And so one can argue that putting in jail is as effective, if not more effective, than the death penalty. And the second thing, there was a quick mention regarding the government having more control. In the Western countries, perhaps this argument does not hold a lot of value because there are a lot of restrictions on the government in terms of how can they exercise or abuse this type of power. However, if this debate were to take place in other parts of the world, such as third world countries, one can easily argue that because there is high possibility of corruption and dictatorship in those countries, the death penalty can be easily abused in order to for the government to achieve whatever they want, despite any morals, despite any laws. One example is if there is an opposing politician, the government can fabricate the evidence or do whatever they can in order to put the death penalty and fully eliminate the competition that they have. But of course, it's unlikely that this debate is taking place.